people think perfectionism is like, my handbag mustn't have any scratches on it or whatever. My document must have no typos. But actually, a much more useful definition of perfectionism is that it's when you think that eventually real life will happen, but it's not happening now, right? So once I get the business off the ground and it's really doing this well, and also when I get the promotion or when my partner finally listens to me or whatever, then that will be real life, and this is just preparing for that next life.
Sarah, thanks so much for joining me on another session of Kickoff Sessions. The conversation for today is all around failure, which is quite interesting. And you've already done a lot of books and there's a lot of different topics on this, but why is it like you picked failure of all different areas you could possibly write on?
Well, we picked it as a group at the School of Life. We do all of our writing as a group, so there's no one author on a book. But we're very interested in failure at the School of Life. And we find that in particular, there's there's a lot of sort of self-help in the world, and much of it, when it approaches failure, says something like, "Oh, let's talk about how to avoid failure, and if it happens, this is a bunch of advice about how to build on your failure to succeed harder in the future, and then you will be wildly successful and maybe meet Elon Musk someday or something." And we felt that that was entirely the wrong kind of advice for failure, because we're living in a very achievement-oriented society. If you go on the tube, pretty much every advertisement, with a few exceptions, is telling you some way that you can be more successful. And by successful, a very narrow band of things are usually implied. So having a very exciting love life, or at least quite a stable, bourgeois, respectable marriage, having a, ladder climbing career, or maybe a cool startup, one or the other, looking particularly glamorous, or having a bunch of friends who seem very cool to go on holiday with, right? So a very narrow definition of success, and then we're thinking about how to achieve that version of success all the time. It's a very achievement-oriented society. And we think that this massively screws up people's ability to judge, first of all, what an okay life is outside of this extremely sort of intensive rung of achievements. And secondly, to realize the very sad but true reality, which is that nearly all of us are going to fail quite hard and probably permanently in lots of areas of our life. And we talk a
100%.
lot in the book about these areas that, lots of us are going to be in a fight with our own children who are going to dislike us. Many of us are going to never quite get our careers off the ground and live a fairly mediocre career life. And that's just how life works. In fact, that's how capitalism is designed. It's designed so that most of us are going to be mediocre, essentially. Lots of marriages fail in the sense of end anyway, and also fail in other ways as well. And so we wanted to make a conversation about failure, let's say, with our readers, that was much more realistic about this. And to go from that premise that you're going to fail in lots of areas of your life. We've failed too. All of us have had massive life failures. You may not bounce back and become a wildly successful entrepreneur, but there are lots of other ways of looking at failure that might be meaningful and at least a consolation in your time of dire need for that, but also maybe a source of philosophical perspective.
Yeah, it's cool because like a lot of that as well would be that persona that you just discussed at the start. Like as in, it was as if it was already painted to us. And that could have went back, 20, 30 years whereby, you have like the beautiful woman, perfect guy as well. There's like the perfect kind of lifestyle. And then that kind of comes with the American dream. And when I kind of came across to like Europe, it's like, this is what we're trying to achieve. And like,
Yes,
it's
the
funny
Americans
because
are
like,
definitely the same. I'm sorry about us. We're
but it's funny
terrible.
because like if it was so achievable, everyone would be doing it. Like as in we'd all be in the 0.1%. But it's the
And what
fact
would
that
that
like that's
mean? How
kind of
could 100% of people be there anyway? What? Right?
exactly.
It's incoherent, the idea of success, when you open it up very widely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if you're trying to like actually, I don't know, even achieve it, there has to be that kind of bell curve. And if you remember like your exams or younger GCSEs or whatever, there is that bell curve of like the top percentile, the middle percentile, and the middle bracket is the bulge bracket. And that's where a lot of people kind of sit in. So I think that's kind of cool. It's an interesting perspective because like even for myself, I'm working in a startup, I have my own company, but there's no talk about like, okay, things may not go positively.
Right.
And
And
that's what's
most
really
startups
interesting
fail,
today.
right? Most new businesses in Europe fail within a year. I think 80 something percent of them, depending
Yeah.
on how you count. Most businesses fail eventually. And
Mhm.
that's
And
precisely how capitalism is designed to work.
100%. And even like in the following years from there, it's like a further like 60% fail from the years of like
Yes.
2 to 5. So
Yep.
it's a fact that like you may like skip it for now, but then there's also that kind of possibility of like longer term. So that's kind of interesting because like it's not always about like a quick event that's either success or failure. You know, it's not
That's
as
true.
binary as that. You know, it's a
There's
longer
this sort of
duration period.
ambiguous just living and maybe eventually knowing this thing probably won't work out, but you're doing it for now,
Yeah,
right?
that's cool because like a lot of people don't know when to cut shit. You know, people could drag
Mm.
their heels, like you were saying about relationships. Relationships is a perfect
Definitely
example.
in romantic relationships, people don't know
How
when
many
to
people
leave.
stick it? How many people stick in those relationships and they just end up being terrible, end up being like dreadful, essentially. And I don't know, is that a factor of comfort? And that's kind of what I wanted to ask as well, is about like, so like, what is the concept of why we're failing in the first place? And especially even looking from a relationship perspective, is there an element of comfort to kind of stick through those times instead of like cutting it off? You know, like how does that kind of
Yeah, I
work?
mean, I think people fail to leave romantic relationships for all kinds of reasons, right? And
Mhm,
I won't drag this out into a huge conversation about this, but
mhm,
we're a very psychoanalytic organization at the School of Life, so we're very interested in the way people's childhood tends to influence the way they behave as adults, and that's especially
mhm,
true for romantic relationships because essentially our first, deepest, most vulnerable bond is with our caregivers when we're young, and then we grow up and we kind of project this as our main reference for what love is onto romantic
mhm,
relationships, and all kinds of fascinating and um, destructive things can happen as a result. So, we might become what's often called now in the sort of therapeutic Instagram jargon world codependent,
mhm,
enabling one another's worst possibilities. We might do all kinds of things. But I do think one of the things to point to the failure question is that we have a very narrow idea of what constitutes success in romantic life. We at least most people, not all, but most people still are looking for a monogamous relationship, possibly leading to marriage and almost certainly to cohabitation. And
mhm,
if anything goes terribly wrong, that's seen as a failure. There's not the idea that, just like friendships, things can wane and come back together, or you might have multiple people that you're in love with, or there's lots of ways of
mhm,
putting this. But the real point is it's a narrow model. So if anything goes wrong, it's
mhm.
then a failure. If
Yeah,
somebody commits adultery, well, I'm not condoning adultery, of course, but we don't have a sort of model where that might be bad, but not a huge failure. Um, so I think romantic love is something that we've applied the sort of achievement model to, but that's terribly sad for lots of
mm,
reasons because ultimately love is where we go to be understood and supported and to deal with failure well. And if we've also made it into an achievement thing, then our whole lives have become a framework of either like you're good or bad, and there's no
yeah,
in the middle, and you must achieve this
100%.
or else you suck as a person.
And I think it's because, like, if you think about the other aspects of life, so if it is your career, if it
Yeah.
is your education, or even if it is like, I don't know, your health and your habits, they do seem to be achieve oriented. So like you need to be doing the best at them. You know, you can't have like it's not accepted to have like a shit like healthy lifestyle, you know, as in you want to have a healthy lifestyle and that's like the achievement. So it
Hmm.
kind of seems like that's filtered into the relationship aspect. Then it's the fact that we've looked at it from a binary perspective to say if it's either going to be good or bad in that instance. Whereas we
Yeah.
should be looked at from a different lens of like, okay, do you actually, do you have a connection with the person? Is this what you want to actually do? And does it potentially bring up other aspects of your life? Because that's what a relationship is, isn't it? It improves your life. It doesn't take away from it.
Yeah, it should support you essentially. And I think in order for things to be supportive, one of our absolute favorite psychoanalysts is this guy called Donald Winicott, and he was working in the sort of shortly after World War II, especially with parents, and they were parents I think we would recognize today in the more bourgeois corners of London. So they were not in the bourgeois corners of London, but they had some anxieties similar to the ones you see there.
Mhm.
They were saying, oh, but what if Johnny doesn't eat his peas? Am I then a very bad parent because I didn't make sure that he got the correct amount of vitamin K based on this pamphlet in the health food store, whatever.
Mhm.
And more generally, a sort of high level of anxiety that they were going to get parenting wrong. And so Winnicott developed this idea, which we find incredibly helpful, called the good enough parent. And the good enough parent is wildly imperfect. They probably are highly distracted and forget the kids' lunch a lot. And they have their own problems in life. Maybe they didn't do that well in their career, or they had to get divorced, or whatever. But they're basically there for the kid. They show up most of the time. They're paying it quite a bit of attention. They love it. They support it. They don't do anything wildly abusive, of course. They're there. The kid knows that they're loved. And Winicott said that that's actually what the kid needs. The kid doesn't need more than that. It doesn't need the peas. It doesn't need the fancy prenatal yoga class. It doesn't need mummy to be a perfect angel who never feels tired or needs to leave dad and start again. They just need a loving, caring parent.
Yeah.
And that's what makes children grow up and be reasonably decent people. Not only do we think that's a wonderful point, but we think it extends to many more things. And I think relationships are especially, careers also, but we can get to that in a minute. But relationships are especially an area where good enough is much better than like wildly successful. Otherwise you go around demanding of your partner, no, you must understand the depths of my soul even more and be like 50% hotter based on conventional attractiveness norms. And that's a terrible way to have a relationship.
100%.
You just want someone who like loves you and gets you and is basically there for you, and you click reasonably well. And if you start demanding more than that, you lose, I think, a certain kind of perspective on what love really is.
That's because you're taking it from the model of social media or whatever, and I know that kind of topic is
Yeah,
even rinsed, but like if you're looking through that perfect lens, like that idealistic, like this is what I want for my life, for my career, for my relationships. It's not such you're destined for failure, but you're just looking at the cracks always. So it's kind of like it's really like a glass half empty perspective in that instance, because even though you have
it's
something
true. You'll
great
see all the
that you can
deficits
nurture,
rather than the
you look at all the
strengths.
deficits. Exactly. I don't
Yeah.
know. That kind of leads into it can create more issues as well versus being happy with the present, which is difficult to do, and being grateful for what you have, and then trying to like actually mitigate maybe some of the potential failures around it then by driving issues. And that's why you're creating issues in your career, creating issues in your relationships.
Yeah, this is a great point. I mean, just briefly to add on to that, like most psych research that we have, and I have to read lots of research about psychology for my I'm also working on a PhD about
Nice.
psychology and politics, and um, points that points to the fact that happiness is almost entirely, in most cases, dependent on our expectations. So,
Hmm.
for example, arranged marriages, if you're in a culture where that's normal, are just as happy as the average marriage in London where you met somebody on Tinder or whatever. And they're just as happy. People report being just as happy. Why? Because this has met their expectations, right? They had a very probably different set of expectations, like this person will get along with my family and be in my ethnic group and practice the same religion as me, and we will have children and be happy raising children or whatever. And
Hmm.
that marriage meets their expectations just as well as if you and I fall madly in love and decide that we're the one luckiest person in the entire universe. And
Yeah.
lots of other things work this way. Once you adjust your expectations, even if you've, let's say, won the lottery or, for that matter, gotten run over by a car and become paralyzed, it turns out our happiness levels basically return to normal.
Mm.
And so, what our expectations are is really important. Of course, that's why we've written this book. If our expectations are low enough, reasonably low enough, we can be very happy, much happier maybe than somebody who's doing better than us objectively, but still striving and feels dissatisfied.
That's so interesting because you may be aware of a guy called Mark Pollock. He was paralyzed like 15, 20 years ago. He was an Irish guy.
Okay.
He's also blinded as well. And since then, he's gone on to like, climb multiple mountains. He's done loads of
He's
speeches and
doing
whatnot.
marathons, I think. I think I've
He was doing marathons, I think.
Yeah, I think I might have met this man actually, but not in a meaningful way where he would remember me. Um,
Super, super interesting dude. And he's actually, I think he's coming on my podcast next couple of months. But to your point, like a lot of questions would be like, what motivates you? What kind of keeps you happy? And he says he has those expectations. He's just happy to be able to speak to people or interact with people or even be alive. And that's what's so
yeah,
interesting is the fact that he's changed his expectations, whereby before he had his accident everything was completely fine, but then he alters those expectations, and maybe that's when you're setting those expectations that are so high that you live a life that's kind of not fruitful. And I even give a good example in my own case. Like I said, if I'm ever thinking about my own career, I need to be able to like slow down a small bit, or even my own podcast, just slow down and
hmm
say like, okay, I'm happy with 10,000 downloads. I'm happy with, you know,
yeah.
more like as in like a certain kind of
Oh, I'm so
baseline.
with you here. My
But
achievement-oriented brain, I have to constantly tell her like, it's fine. This year can just be this one achievement, and don't seek 17,000 other ones or whatever.
exactly. But I think you're a bit more like aware of like how you think about it than me. Like because for me, it's
Mm,
like it's such like type A personality, just like kind of next thing, next thing, next thing. But my girlfriend, oddly enough, is like the opposite. She's like more chill, more like present, appreciative in the moment, and then she's the one that has to like stop me in that moment and say, 2 years ago this is what you wanted, and now it's happened 2 years later,
Yeah,
and now you're thinking of the next thing. So
totally.
how do you manage those expectations? Like, where do you set those hard and fast rules?
Oh, this is such a great question. Well, I mean, there are thousands of things I could say, but I think it's worth pointing out that we're very influenced by the Stoics, which you've probably seen a lot of interest in the last few years. So we're very interested in these thinkers from ancient Greece and Rome that built a school thinking about how to live more sort of reflective and philosophical lives.
Mhm,
And also, although this is much less emphasized in the sort of modern self-help literature around Stoicism, how to live a morally good life where you help your community. So it's often used just to sort of help you deal with difficulty or
mhm,
anxiety, but it's also about how to live a good life for other people. But in any case, one of the things the Stoics did, which we really appreciate, is that they talked a lot about how to usefully lower your expectations and almost start them at the bottom, right? So,
mhm,
you're alive. That's an amazing thing. How could that have even come to happen in the sort of dust of the universe being created so many
mhm,
billions and trillions of years ago, right? Or um, sometimes some of the Stoics would practice sleeping on the floor to imagine what it would be like to be homeless, and they might eat out of a dog's dish.
mhm,
Um, or they would talk about even things that are extremely painful and difficult, like losing your children, and they would say, like, you have to start with the baseline assumption that you will. I mean, especially back then, of course, for the
mhm.
high mortality rate of small children, but you have to assume they will die. And then if they don't die, you will be delighted. You will be
Mhm.
amazed at this incredible miracle. But we have to work some of that loss into our sort of baseline understanding of the world. Now, thankfully, we have much lower child mortality rates, although of course some people still do lose their children. But I think the same perspective can often be very fruitfully applied to other things. And I think this is going to become even more important now that we live in a much more obviously broken world.
Mhm.
After this pandemic, I think, and doubtless the financial consequences that have followed, if you have a job at all, that's an amazing thing. It is. It really is,
100%.
even if it's stocking the supermarket. Um, so if there's something about adjusting our expectations that is actually profoundly philosophical that we look at a lot. That's one answer. I mean, I have dozens,
Yeah.
but let's see where that takes us.
No, I completely agree because, like, it's almost as if you kinda go back to Gustavik's original baseline of if you had nothing, what's your, your hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What do I just need to survive, to satisfy what I have to, eat, sleep, have a roof over my head, and then you slowly taper up from there. But I just think it's the it's the irrational, individual that just runs with things, and we're all irrational, and then they kinda set those high expectations. It's kinda when people focus on the output versus actually focusing on actually the input. They're saying that they want, a successful business or a really successful relationship or loads of
Hmm.
friends or whatever, and they're kind of chasing that kind of aspect instead of like looking at those small incremental targets. And one thing I kind of do on the side as well is I work with a lot of young professionals, kind of around career direction, career mentoring, and most people will always start with the end result. They'll always say, like, I want to, you know, achieve this much in my salary this year. I want to achieve like 50, 60K a year, whatever. Or, I want to close this amount of deals per year. But they're not setting the baseline expectations and going back to the original one. That's what I'm always trying to bring back to, is going back to the, day one, what do we need to do, and going kind of step by step. And that this kind of leads you to being disappointed as a result, because how do you have the data to know that you're going to be able to extrapolate that far ahead in the future?
It also means you have to throw so much of your life away. I was
Hmm.
thinking about one of the things another faculty member said in a class at the School of Life, and they pointed out that people think perfectionism is like, my handbag mustn't have any scratches on it or whatever. My document must have no typos. But actually, a much more useful definition of perfectionism is that it's when you think that eventually real life will happen, but it's not happening now, right? So
Hmm.
once I get um, the 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 business off the ground and it's really doing this well, and also when I get the promotion or when my partner finally listens to me or whatever,
Yeah,
then that will be real life, and this is just preparing for that next life. And
yeah,
I mean, without going too deeply into it, this is a very Christian way of looking at the world. Sorry to any Christians listening. It's a very, the next life is
mhm,
is the real life out there after death. But regardless of your sort of metaphysical beliefs, it's a very bad way of living your one life on earth, in this sense, right? That if you think, oh, I'm just going to suffer and think that I'm not enough for most of my life, and then maybe eventually I'll achieve something, and then my real life will happen, you're missing the good stuff. Like that is the good stuff. Being in the cafe with your partner and they're a bit grumpy because neither of you slept that well. That's the real stuff of life. And and so is the sort of mid-level job that you don't particularly love, because it's still you trying to do something interesting in the world, and other people are around you. Like, that's real life. And you might never hit whatever thing you've dreamed of, but even if you do, you're throwing out like this huge chunk of your life beforehand that you get to enjoy and notice and observe and experience. And like, whew.
100%. No, but it's interesting because like that's what life is. Like life is
Yeah,
like going to the supermarket and picking up like bread and milk. Like that's like what the
that's your
reality
life.
is. And it's like, like going out with your partner or your friends and just like going for walks and shit. Like being able to appreciate that is what like, you know, cumulatively adds up then, and it compounds over time. So you may have that North Star that you want to get to because you're just ambitious, but that doesn't mean that you should like, forego today for the future. And that's a big concept, even with how people kind of manage money and manage wealth. It's like, should we sacrifice today for the future, or should we enjoy the present and then not think about the future? So there's that's kind of like how it was phrased from like a kind of outside perspective, but there just needs to be that kind of balance, because otherwise, this is why people fear their 30s. And I actually was thinking this the other day. I was speaking to some guy the other day,
Yeah,
and they
interesting.
were
I've just turned 30 about 6 months
"Th-
ago or something. So
no way,
I
you
went
look a
through,
lot younger
yes,
than
I
that. Don't
threw out
worry."
all kinds of things in my life. I left like a very long relationship. I changed up my career. I did the
No way,
classic. I had
the
classic
classic.
29-year-old life. Yeah.
So basically, the question was like, when you get to your 30s, like, no, the question was, do you fear your 30s?
Yes.
And the guy I was speaking to was saying that, like, it's not that you fear your 30s. You only fear your 30s if you are like, not looking forward to something, or not like building on your life or enjoying the present, and that was kind of the issue, is that often our life can get better because you get a better appreciation for it. Because when you're younger, like you just, I don't know, you're running around, you're half pissed all the time, you're just in and out of uni or whatever. But as
Yeah.
you get old, you get a better appreciation and you enjoy life more. And that's what I want to take up the most, was the fact that as I get a little bit older, I want to be able to appreciate those moments, and
I think
not
this is
like
a great example. Yeah, because one things I've noticed is there are aspects of my life in my 30s so far, which is obviously very new, um,
yeah,
but that are better because, like, I've done the really grueling London commute first bit of work, that where you are
mhm,
constantly just responsive to your manager all the time and desperately hoping someone will notice that you are in fact working hard. And I do
mhm,
feel, for example, that some aspects of my life are objectively better. Like, my career is objectively better. I have more friends now, that I've not been a stranger in a strange land in London. I have
mhm,
better sense of what I need in a relationship, etc. But to bring it to this last point about what I have a better sense of what I need, a lot of my happiness is just that I look at things differently, right? Like, maybe I've gotten to a better, quote unquote, place in my life after 20 years, 10 years since my 20s. But I also just know much more what matters. And I spend a lot more time than I would have when I was 24. Like, I think we're just going to sit in this cafe for 20 more minutes and drink this latte because it's nice. And
yeah,
there's not enough nice. Or like, I went to see my grandmother, and that was a big deal because of COVID. It was tricky and lots of things were going wrong in the world. And like, I remember that in my 20s, I used to pull out my laptop all the time. And I was
mhm,
like, we're not pulling out this laptop the entire time that we're at grandma's house, because the point is to sit with her and like watch her watch the bird feeder. That's the goal,
mhm,
And anyway, I guess to me, accomplishment is very nice. And sometimes we've got to do it, especially when sort of moral imperatives hang upon it.
mhm.
But appreciation is almost as nice as accomplishment, and sometimes more so.
Yeah. 100%, absolutely. And it's just more so the fact that if we're all collectively thinking of it, of achievement instead of appreciation, that's when it becomes more challenging. So you need to be able to kind of counter that. So when I
Yeah,
was
the
looking
cultural
through
pressure.
exactly, when I was looking through the On Failure book in particular, there was
Yeah.
a lot of areas around perception of media and failure, which is
Yeah.
obviously just super fucking hot in general, like media's influence around just any sort of narrative. But like, how did you kind of think about it from a media perspective? Because like, let's say in the startup world, um, we went through this period whereby like, we would like blame a lot of companies for failing, especially startups, and then it would go through a
Mhm.
period whereby a lot of startup founders, their expectation was to fail. And then there's another more narrative, but as you said, actually, when you were started recording, about celebrating failure and, oh yeah, just get back on a horse and stuff. Um, And that's
Right,
kind
like,
of like the
now
lens.
you've failed this startup into the ground, you just make another one harder, go.
Yes, exactly. As
Yes.
in like, oh, like it's the second or third time, and like whatever, like statistically that might actually be true, but it's the perception of like it to keep on going. So, what's your kind of thoughts around that from a media perspective?
I interpret this as a question about how the media shapes our sense of what kinds of failure happen to us and what they mean.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess we talk a lot about the media in the book because I think they are still the most dominant narrative that we get outside of maybe like our individual parental guidance or something. And one of the things that's very noticeable about our media is it's not at all forgiving. And I don't mean this in the sense that, like if a policy fails, if a government policy fails, we should be extremely critical because it's very important that we know why it failed, why it was a bad policy, why we shouldn't do that again, who it harmed, what the next policy should be. So I'm not saying we should diminish sort of important like public interest failures like that. That's not what I'm saying. However, it's interesting that the way they report about individual people screwing up is extremely unforgiving, right?
Mm.
If you look at any stories about crime, this person is a reckless, horrible, weirdo, drug addicted pervert. Shame. I mean, we're still sort of at that level of discussion. And even when companies fail, I mean, probably it's not always that they're a weirdo, drug addicted pervert, but sometimes it is. And in any
Mhm.
case, it's also very much like, well, they must have just made the wrong choices, and better people will come ahead and do things better than them.
Yeah.
And I think this is a terrible way of looking at why failure happens. I mean, sometimes things are recklessly driven out of control by someone with a deep personality flaw. Like, let's look at Theranos,
Mhm.
But firstly, a lot of failures happen for much more banal reasons. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, most reasons businesses fail are absolutely more or less either unforeseeable or you kind of knew going in that only one or two people are going to make it in this space, and we're just gambling essentially.
Mhm.
Gambling while working very hard, right? Um, and and I think until we can begin to look at lots of failures that way, as essentially normal happenstance, not particularly necessarily meaningful in either direction, we're going to be really unforgiving when it happens to ourselves, and we're going to have a very unrealistic sense of the world. And then the second thing to say is sometimes our failures in life do happen partially because there are these personal failures, right? So divorce, that might really have been driven, whoops, by you
Mhm.
being incredibly, attracted to younger people at work or something like that. And we're not saying this is good, but we are saying that this is kind of what you should expect of human beings. That we have these deep. We talk about in Greek tragedy how the Greek tragedy is a story of something going horribly wrong because someone has a deep personality flaw. But interestingly, they're not a bad person. They're not like a Disney villain. If you sort of watch a Greek tragedy or read one, they're a nice person actually who kind of cares and is basically interesting. And then they have this one deep flaw. They
Mhm.
have hubris. They are extremely attracted to somebody who's not their spouse, whatever.
Mhm.
And the media doesn't report on this stuff this way either. They're not able to
Mhm.
say, this person drove the business into the ground by making unsound investments because they were wildly, hopelessly utopian about X idea, but they also had this nice quality. They just sort of say, this is an irresponsible, bad person. And
100%.
until we model a new way of talking about A, the normality of failure, the randomness of it, the likelihood of it happening many times to you in your life, and B, the fact that even if we do bad things, we are not fundamentally bad people, I think we're going to be much more dysfunctional as a society about failure itself.
And we're
So we
also
wish we
less
could rewrite
open,
that.
but you're also less open to taking risks as a result because,
Yeah, sure.
if you look through that lens of just like, okay, the media's gonna say shit this, social media's gonna say that,
Yep.
we're looked through this position whereby we're put on this podium to be, I don't know, essentially, scrutinized from every different element. When you're factoring all those different aspects, people are more hesitant to take those risks because they don't want to be that person. And it's not always about being on the front page of, the Independent, but it could be just the fact that they have all of this, um, essentially like subconscious thoughts, and then they're
Hmm.
not being able to take these opportunities or pursue something they want to because of the fact that they're always thinking in the back of their mind, this is the image that's being portrayed, this is the likelihood, I should restrict myself, and that's kind of where it becomes more of an issue, I think, as well, because
Mm.
now you get in this situation where people are siloed into potentially thinking the same way, and they're not necessarily allowed to act the way they usually would have.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it is very interesting as a business problem right?
Mm.
It makes me, every time, I don't know, when you walk down the British high street, I'm always struck that there's the same horrible monopolistic businesses in every single little town. It's so sad, you know. There's the same four shops, Primark and maybe Sainsbury's and Tesco, and okay, but wouldn't it be nice if there were more at least, you know, small interesting businesses? So there's sort of that element. We've made even business boring.
Mhm.
And I think also we've made our individual lives very boring by being afraid of failure.
Mhm.
You know, and we have one model for what it means basically to live a good life, even if you do something terribly minor off the mark, like choose to not have children, or maybe you want to live with your best friend instead of your romantic partner or whatever. Like that is seen as incredibly weird, and you know people will talk about it, right? And we're just very socially pressurable animals, and so um, the fact that we have very narrow definitions of success and that we're afraid of any kind of failure means that we don't experiment, and that's really sad in lots of areas of our life.
Yeah. Last thing I say on that as well is the fact that, like, you know, if you're always thinking about other people's opinions in terms of failure, like, you're going to be so screwed into taking those actions, and you become like essentially paralyzed into making no decision. And a good example was even my podcast. I remember when I was starting it, like, I'd seen statistics, people saying, you know, it's overcrowded and things like this, and
Hmm.
you shouldn't be doing it, whatever. And then I just said, fuck that, let's just do it. Let's just do it really well. Let's just put a good
And
time
maybe
into it
enjoy doing it also.
and enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And maybe the benefits will come just indirectly. It's not about fucking flipping these six-figure businesses. It could be just the indirect and direct benefits that could come from it, you know? And
Hmm.
that was a big thing for me. And I was just like, as a result, just take the move. Just take the move, you know, and just take that step. You said something really interesting there as well about you know, people kind of talking about it or people having a perception.
Yeah.
Um, how do you think that factors in as well to different elements of failure? If like the perception of others is that okay, you're going to fail, or maybe not. That's actually another question. Is do you think people are kind of patiently waiting for you to fail, or do you think that people just assume it and move on with their lives?
Look, I think well, there's two things. First of all, in many cases, people are not paying us that much attention. All of us
Yeah.
have this bias, this instinctive bias, that we think people are like paying a lot of attention to us, because for us, we are the absolute center of the universe, the core of all conscious experience. You know, the meaning of the world. And we
Mm.
imagine somehow that therefore everyone is paying attention to us. But like, I'm not paying attention to hardly anyone except myself in a given moment, at least when I'm making breakfast. I mean, hopefully at some point in my day, I think about other human beings in a deep way. But, you know, we mostly have to focus on our own lives, right? So no one's paying as much attention as our anxiety tells us. I think that's important to say. Um, but the other thing is, you know, we also need to be able to look at other people's opinions as expressions of what is at stake for them, right?
Mm.
And there's a really lovely little bit of this book that I particularly appreciated about the word pity and why the way we use it, at least today, it means something quite problematic. We try to make this distinction between pity and sympathy. Um, so if you come to me and say, you know, I've been broken up with, and I say, "Oh, poor you, you know, that's so
Mm.
hard. Call me any time of the day or night, whatever." That can be pity. What it means is I can see that what's happened to you is bad, 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 and I'm sorry that you're suffering. But it doesn't include myself in any way in the schema of pain that you're involved in, right? It's essentially saying like, I'm fine. No terrible heart-wrenching breakups could ever happen to me. That's why I am a superior being that will lend you pity. And I don't know if you've ever been deeply pitied about something, but it's quite tiring, right? It's just exhausting and it's kind of annoying. And most of all, it's unrealistic, because literally almost anything that could happen to you, Darren, could also happen to me, right? If you
Mhm.
get run over by a car and I come and pity you in the hospital, I'm missing the real point, which is that random horrifying misfortune happens to all of us, and any of us
Mm.
could end up in the hospital bed. And so we try to point out that a lot of people's reactions to others' failure are an attempt to psychologically distance themselves from the possibility of failure happening to them. Your startup fails, and I go, "Oh, it was such an obvious thing from the start that that was never going to work." And what I'm really
Mhm.
saying isn't anything about your startup, whatever it is, even if it's something very implausible. It's saying, I am wise and I would never end up in a situation like that, surely. And it's a psychological distancing technique to prevent ourselves from feeling like failure can happen to us, because not only can it, but it definitely will happen to all of us. And once you see people's public judgments as to do with that, not as a sort of good objective sense of who you are and what your life is like, but as a way of almost magic thinking that hopes to distance oneself from the fundamental vulnerability of human life, I think it's a little bit easier, just a tiny bit, to know that people are going to
100%.
judge.
And where is that place of judgment coming from? Like, as in, so
Fear. We're
yeah,
afraid. Aren't you afraid? I'm so afraid of all the things that could go wrong. Like I'm a freelancer. All the client work could dry up.
mm,
I've watched people get into horrible health problems. Maybe that will happen to me tomorrow. It's very
mm.
comforting to think that something about me has made me immune from that failure, and I can just look at it from far away and judge it.
Yeah, and I think as well, a lot of people that might have like a cloud over it that they just don't factor in these elements of like extreme fear. They just use that kind of structure to say, okay, yeah, that's going to fail, or that's not a good idea, or I would have thought differently. But in actual fact, that's when they're actually fearful of trying it themselves.
Yeah, there's also envy. I think there's a lot of envy because, as you
Mm,
say, and I think you and I are very much on the same page about this from what you said, because we have this chilling effect. I hate to use this term since it's wildly overused in discussions of free speech. But anyway, we have this chilling effect on risk in general because of our fear of failure. Then there are probably a lot of people sitting around thinking, oh, well, you took that risk and now it's very helpful for me to judge you for having taken it and seen it
mm.
fail because I didn't even get to take the risk because I was too afraid. Right. So there's also a kind of we have to shoot down anyone who gets to do things we didn't get to do because deep down we envy that even the attempt,
Yeah,
I
of
think.
course, because like people as well, you get to a situation whereby you wanted to do it. There was a reason why you couldn't. It could be financial. It could be, for other relationships, or just a limitation or constraint on your actual ability. And then you see other people do it, and even if they get good success, it's funny because like, when someone becomes successful, if it's close or whatever, they always say, "Oh, it's easy for you." It was easy for that person, or they were handed it. And that's what's so
Yeah.
interesting is that like they don't see like the work that goes underneath the surface, even if it is a successful relationship, all the work that goes on to try to keep harmony in a relationship, um, that's even a very big task, and that's very even difficult to even be able to maintain. Um, so envy is just it can just ruin those scenarios, and I think that's only when that would also affect the relationship with the individual and that person, if it's a friend as well or whatever. If you end up
Yeah,
being
envy
very
is
envy and
killer.
jealous,
It's a dangerous game. Although it can
yeah,
be really helpful, right? You can turn it around and say, let me notice who I envy and then acknowledge to myself what I really want. We teach this as an exercise at the School of Life.
that's actually
Um,
interesting because and I'll be completely honest as well. When I started my podcast, there was particular guys that I was like, I'd love to get a show as the same size as them. I'd love to be able to do it,
yeah.
just as in terms of just way to like match,
And it's
and
good to
then
dig down into what that is as well, isn't it? Like,
oh,
what is it
100%.
really? Is it really 100,000 followers, or is it that you want a few people who think you're quite a reasonable dude, right?
Exactly,
Um,
exactly, and again, that goes into a
what's the
better
real
story as
psychology?
well. It goes into
Yeah,
even a deeper level to say like, you know, is it really even the number on the screen of 100,000, or is it just like the actual one person liking you? There's so much different ways to weigh that up, but you just look at one model, and I think that's what's good to have, not necessarily a mentor or like a goal, but you use that, and then you look at it from the perspective of why you want to do it. So for me, and I know other people as well, they can get very jealous of other people who have that success, when in fact they actually wanted to be there. Um, so instead of being jealous and then just being resentful, it's like, okay, reverse engineer it. Why am I in that position? How do I get to that position? And how do I just build something or do something that will get me into that path? Um, and I think a lot of people will, stray away from asking those difficult questions, and they'll just leave it at stage one. Fuck that. I don't want to be associated with it, or it was handed to them.
right. Yeah, I think there's something interesting you're saying here about effort. We denigrate others' efforts because it makes us more jealous if we have to acknowledge that they actually worked hard to get what they want, and we
Mhm.
value hard work so deeply in our society. But to challenge that, I just want to say also that equally, you could look at some people that you envy and notice their accomplishments, but realize that uh, let's put this another way. A lot of the time when we envy someone's accomplishment, we're really just envying the fact that other people see them as accomplished, right? That we envy like the fact that other people respect them and like them and seek them out and want to be their friends. And so
Mhm.
something I always say when I'm teaching our failure class, for example, or just generally when we're sort of running media at the School of Life, is um, that many people want to be successful so they can have friends. I mean, that is the fantasy of being the celebrity. Very few people think, oh, yes, I want to be Steve Jobs because I want to be in the meeting with the user experience problem. Right. I mean, maybe some of them really want to deal with the user experience design problem, but most of them want to be Steve Jobs because they get up on the stage. That's the moment they imagine. I'm on the stage, everyone is looking at me, and they think I'm smart. right? Or I'm, a famous Hollywood director, and they don't think I'm in this cutting studio cutting the film with the editing team. They think I'm at the club and everyone is taking photos of me on the red carpet. And this
Yeah.
is really important to notice, because what it means, I'm afraid, is that actually your fantasy about being a Hollywood director is about people looking at you, noticing you, caring about you, and wanting to hang out with you. And if that's the case, then your fantasy about success is really a fantasy about friendship, basically, right?
Mhm.
Popularity, yes, but ultimately like friendship. And friendship, unlike all the other forms of success, arguably, is something that everyone can, in theory, have. It's not
Mhm.
a competition. If you have a friend, Darren, it doesn't make me have one less friend, right? It's a completely different thing. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's the antidote to all of this anxiety about failure and success. You can have a friend no matter how much else you fail in life.
Mm.
So
That's so
anyway,
funny.
maybe make a
No,
podcast, maybe make a friend.
but it's so true though, like because like if you look at it from a social media context, that's just the numbers on the screen, like followers on the screen, and then we envy that because it's the fact that it's like social proof. So it's like this proportion of Instagram, if it's 1,000 people, 10,000 people, you know, have given social proof to someone that we wish it
Yes.
was happening upon us. Um, and that's where it gets into that very delicate area around, social media and just even the whole concept of acquiring new customers. And this is actually an interesting take on it as well. So, um, one thing that I'm always kind of focused on is the fact that the quantity of followers or the quantity of like likes you get, whatever, mean nothing. Like they literally mean nothing apart from the engagement you get from it and the actual impact that you have. So, for myself, I have a couple of thousand followers on like LinkedIn or whatever. Those followers mean absolutely nothing. It's the people that actually get something from posts and actually hopefully learn something and take something and get some enjoyment from it. Not necessarily like learn and improve their life, but just if they get some sort of enjoyment from it,
Mhm.
um, that's what's actually valuable. And if you compare that to the Instagram model, whereby it's just like numbers, 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 numbers and likes and followers, it's like none of those have actual depth to any of the interactions. And that's where it gets into a very, very difficult rut of just chasing those numbers. So I've tried to like go backwards and say, okay, it's not about trying to get more followers, it's about to actually help an individual person. And again, the theory is like
Mhm.
if you can help one person, you can technically help 10, we can help technically help 100 if it's at scale. But why you doing that in the first place? If you understand fundamentally why you want to do it, then you can go and do that and take that kind of path.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. And I think also it's much easier to hold on to psychologically in the long run, right? If
Mhm.
your goal is people listen to my podcast and they feel less afraid of taking a small risk in their career, then you don't have then there's not the same horrifying like, oh my god, we've got to get 3,000 new followers this week. You've got to look out for some people on your channel that are saying something like that in the comments and talk to them, and if that's not helping them do that, ask why, right? Or whatever it is. And I think this is a
Mhm.
much better long-term motivator than constant expansion. I mean, you're kind of making the distinction here between something that's about the mission of the thing versus sort of what traditional capitalist growth is about, which is, as mindless as a cancer, arguably. Growth in itself is just a thing
Yeah.
that happens and it might not mean very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thing about like customer acquisition over retention. Like
Hmm.
everyone, including startups, always just focused on growth metrics, um, which is
It's
a profitability
exhausting.
metrics. But that's the whole purpose is that like
And you'll burn everyone out. I mean, sidebar, as a content creator, like,
Mm,
there's a reason that, you should delay because, for example, in app design, you lose all your first thousands of users because you have a different product when you start and they're using a different app, and then you eventually figure out what on earth the app is for, which takes a long time. Remember, YouTube was originally a dating website, right? Everything was
mm,
originally some other thing. And then you finally figure out what your product is, and you've burned your relationship with your first, you know,
mhm.
20,000, or for that matter 20 million users, to get to the point where your product really works. So the idea that the number that you have, especially at the beginning, is very valuable is nonsense. What you want is a key number of people that represent a market that
Yeah.
are genuinely interested in your product and will
And what
stick
you also
around
want is, yeah, it's to stick
and to
around with like
learn
customers,
what it is.
customers to give you feedback, customers to give you insights. So you're to your point about profiling, like
Yes.
even your listeners, it's like what is the actual value proposition. So especially even for your courses, like there's no point in you delivering a fucking course to 1,000 people if everyone walks out the door and you've no idea about what they
Yeah,
what they
totally.
learned or
I
what they
I'm a
got from it.
content fiend. I used to be head of content. That was the title at School of Life. Then I went off to do this PhD. But one of the things I would most do is I would just stand at the back of the room and kind of gently glower at people until they filled out their feedback forms, which sounds horrifying, but actually it's the
Yeah.
most important thing, right? Because you want to know,
Yeah.
what is this doing for you? Why are you here? And then you find out all kinds of interesting things about how, people
Mhm.
are here because they don't want to get divorced, or they do want to get divorced, or mostly they want friends, or whatever it is, and then you go build the content. Which is
Yeah.
all to say that the metric of success as scale is very stupid, and the metric of success as I helped somebody and they told me how is
Mhm.
much better, even at a commercial level, never mind from a sort of obituary perspective.
Absolutely, but it's really cool to see like the ties between the psychological aspect of like friendships and relationships in a business context and even in a careers concept, because it's the same principle in terms of like we all just want something and we're trying to like put these fucking metrics on it to achieve it, and we're trying to get to a certain point, but no one
Hmm.
understands why they're doing it. And that's why like a lot of startups, especially at the very, very early stage, like people are running around like headless chickens, not knowing what they're actually looking for, or
Yeah.
or even like a biggest thing is that people that I work with as well is like young guys and girls who would take jobs, especially graduate programs, because they're often just like feed your brain of random shit, but they have no idea why they're doing it. So you could do anything,
Mm,
right? And this is my concept is that like when you're 23, 24, you can
yeah.
literally do anything, but you've decided to take a particular job, okay? You have
Yep.
no idea why you're doing it. And now you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, quote unquote. Um, and that's what to me is fucking crazy, because what's the right thing to do? You know? You just have been told that that there's this narrative that you should do this because it might give you a return of a salary, and a salary is good because you don't die from it. Like,
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I
These are the
think,
things that I talk about regularly.
yeah, look, I think one of the things that is really striking, I remember going into working for the first time, is that it's much less coherent than you think it is, even in a good organization, right?
Mhm.
Um, because everyone else, basically, because you think, I guess, I grew up in a world, admittedly pre, Trump, COVID, etc. But I grew up in a world where it seemed kind of like adults knew what they were doing, right? They had jobs and
Exactly.
they drove the car and
Exactly.
they gave you advice about things and they seemed competent. And so then I left university and I even had a master's degree because I was silly and fancy. And it turns out that nobody knows what they're doing most of the time. Even the smart people are wandering around thinking, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do this month to make a new product? I have no idea. Maybe let's try something about nature? Question mark. Right?
Yeah.
Um, and that actually life just requires this massively high level of uncertainty. And I just remember thinking like, oh, this is everyone is just making shit up. Like some people are making shit up with intelligent background knowledge, and some
Yeah.
people are making shit up without that. But regardless, there's a sort of high level of uncertainty, and I think people who fail to apply that to their own understanding of their lives aren't able to leave a job they don't actually like or do that
Mhm.
job well.
Mhm. I couldn't agree more, and I'll leave on this note. It's funny you said that about like how everyone hasn't a fucking clue, because some people are just better at disguising it, and it's usually people that are
Uh
like quite
huh.
logical and can break down problems, like can suppress it, but they are still
Oh,
like
I love that you're pointing
looking
about logical.
around.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're still like
I can make an
have
argument.
no
I
idea.
must know what I'm doing. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and they might follow
Just a
down like a
skill.
strategic path. You know, they might be like, okay, like this is how we should do it, but they're still at the same level than someone who would be quite like irrational. And even if I compared it to even my own parents, like as in, they wouldn't think about it in a sensible way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're at a disadvantage than someone who's actually really, really intelligent about it, because they're both applying the same, non-structured approach to an issue. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It's funny, and you see that just huge in the working world, which makes it way funnier, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's because we're terribly afraid of failure, right? I mean, we just think
Yeah,
I've got to seem like I know what I'm doing because otherwise I will have a failure and then I will be a failure.
yeah.
Instead, you should think I'm definitely going to fail a lot, and then I'm going to, pick up this book by the School of Life and cry myself to sleep with it under my pillow. But eventually, I'll realize that this is just an aspect of the human experience, and
Yeah.
no amount of, uh,
What's what's interesting there as well, one thing
prep is
to
going to get me out of
notice
that.
as well is the fact that like you have it's not always just like one thing that will lead. It's going to be a combination of like miniature failures. So like to your point there, but a working world, like it's like okay, because I don't know this one thing, I'm immediately a failure. I'm going to fuck this up and just not fit in well in this company. It's like no, if you make that mistake over the course of fucking 20 times, then yeah, fair enough, that might happen. But you shouldn't be fearful of like making mistakes, because of the fact that it's actually more the combination we're looking at versus the actual individual scenario.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, failure is this sort of big and small thing, and lots of small failures are just what it means to wake up in the morning and go to work, I think.
Mhm.
Um,
Literally.
yeah, truly,
Literally.
like, most of the time, okay, people didn't like this class. What does that mean? I remember going through I'm developing a curriculum, you just get, I don't know,
Yeah.
70 bad things before you get the right kind of, oh, this is what the curriculum should look like, maybe.
Yeah.
And most things are like this, even if you're not doing product development. But yeah,
100%. So leaving this note, where can we find your book,
it's
links, all that
coming
stuff?
out. I think it's coming out very soon, and it will be on all the places you find books, your local bookstore. But
Awesome.
most of all, come to our website, schooloflife.com, and buy it, and then you can see all the other things we do. We also have lots of free content. We have a YouTube channel that has free videos every week. We've got classes if you want to get online and interact with other human beings on a particular subject. We've got free articles. So yeah, come buy the book from us or from your local bookseller, of course.
Cool. I'll have everything included as well in the description. Usually that's my
Wonderful.
usual approach. So thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.